Welcome to you all, and yeah, the technique is doing what I want. That's nice. Welcome to you all this Thursday evening at the Pont. My guest of the evening was born in 1960 in London as the son of Caribbean emigres and grew up in the East End. His artistic career is characterized by its endorsement of black history and culture and the freedom of sexual orientation. Together with other black students of fine arts and communication, he had founded the Sankofa Film and Video Collective in 1984 and produced Territories, his graduation film at the prestigious Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design. And in 1989, he won international recognition for Looking for Langston, a filmic essay on Langston Hughes, one of the most outstanding Afro-American poets and a member of the Harlem Renaissance. Both films are on view now in the exhibition. He was nominated for the Turner Prize in 2001 for his works The Long Road to Mazatlan and Vagabondia, and has received wide acclaim for works including Western Union Small Boats, Fantôme Afrique, True North, Baltimore and Paradise on Mirrors. His 2010 installation 10,000 Waves has been on display in over 15 international cities so far, and his latest work, Playtime, has been exhibited as a single-screen installation at Metro Pictures, New York, and as a 7-screen installation at the Victoria Monroe Gallery in London that is representing the artist, as his gallery Ron Mandels in Amsterdam, who's also here, Galerie Helga de Alvar in Madrid, Metro Pictures in New York, Galeria Naar Rosselen in Sao Paulo, and the Rosalind Oxley 9 Gallery in Sydney. His work is in the collections of museums and private collections throughout the world, including the Museum of Modern Art, Tate, the UK Government Art Collection, Centre Pompidou, the Guggenheim, the Hirshhorn Museum, Brandtros Museum, and, of course, Museum de Pont. A few weeks ago, this museum opened the first retrospective of the artist in the Netherlands. Tonight he is here. Can you please give him a warm welcome, Mr. Isaac Julien. So we first start to ask what you want to drink.
Some water would be very nice.
Yeah? And afterwards you'll help yourself and do as if you're at home, okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll take one myself. It's a lot of biographical information I was sharing with the people, but it began all with Territories. As we see your first film, about the underprivileged position of black people in London in the 80s, and that's the time you grew up there.
Yes.
Is it a film about yourself?
Well, in a way, yes. I mean, in a way, you could say all the films were about myself, but the film Territories was important because it was a film that I made while I was a student at St. Martin's School of Art, and the story behind making the film is quite sort of interesting because I was a student at St. Martin's School of Art and I had made a foundation course, and at the end of my foundation course there's a show at the Royal Academy which is called the Summer Exhibition, and everybody submits their paintings there. In fact, it's nicknamed the kind of show for sort of Sunday painters.
Yeah.
But also at the time my professors also would submit their works there. And one of my professors, Adrian Sell, who was a painter then, before he was a critic, submitted his work, and I submitted my work for a joke, and I got my works into the exhibition, and actually it was quite embarrassing. But one of the good things that happened from having my painting shown was I was able to sell the work.
Yeah.
So it was a long time ago, it's 1980, and from the funds from making the sale of that work, I bought my Super 8 camera. And so, in a way, Territories is a work which is shot on Super 8 mainly, and also 16mm. And Nottingham Gate Carnival was the place that I used to go to every summer, bank holiday August, before you go back to school. People used to go to the carnival, and for me it was very exciting. and it was a moment of black culture expression on the streets of London. And at the time, I was very worried about how this event was being policed. It was almost as if this culture expression couldn't breathe or live. And so, in a way, Territories was very much about documenting that event, and at the same time trying to make a work that was also very, in a way, carnivalesque in its aesthetics, the way that it looked. And it's very much about sound and music.
But you're telling that it's a lot about the carnival, but it's also about the riots and the clash between the police and the black youngsters in the city.
It is, but the thing was, the intention of carnival actually was to have a good time, you know, and, you know, so there was a kind of intention in carnival, but of course this idea of the assembly of lots of black people into one space, this was perceived as a kind of threat.
Yeah.
And so when people were kind of too closed in, then it developed into a riot, you know. So, of course, you know, my book that I did for MoMA is called Riot, and the exhibition is called Riot. And I guess you could say one of the reasons why I, you know, wanted to name the book Riot, and also, of course, this exhibition is called Riot, is in a way, it does begin with Territories, because it's a film which I sort of was first known by, but also, in a way, it was this sort of collision, you could say, or kind of contestation, or clash that produced this kind of energy. And I guess you could say that if you think about punk rock, you know, that was also kind of a culture that was quite into dissidence or contestation, but it also produced this sort of creative energy, you know. And so I think in a film like Territories, yes, it's about rights, it's about music, it's about youth culture, and but it's also about this sort of creative energy as well. And so,
what I like a lot in the film is that you are starting somewhere to mix images like this, that you have the policeman and the boy as if they are hugging each other.
Yes, because
that you bring the two worlds together, the two.
Yeah, because I think at that time it was I saw myself as belonging to lots of different worlds, and I write about this in the right book. But in some ways, I think sometimes you have like a kind of utopian vision about what the world can be, or what are the possibilities. So I think in this early moment, I'm trying to bring these two things together, but they're not quite fitting. But they're sort of on top of one another. They're causing, there's a kind of friction, you could say. And in a way, I was very much into bringing these different images into play with one another, which would be also quite provocative.
Yeah, it's almost provocative that the black man is kissing the policeman, or it seems like it in this still.
Yeah, because I think because in a way at that time I was very interested in the work of a writer called Transferon, and I think in his writings he was very interested in the idea around fear and fantasy, and the question around fear and fantasy, around sort of the fear of the other and the love of the other, the question of the ways in which you have on the one hand this kind of you have this sort of like question of the way that sort of, I guess, black cultures or black sexualities get played out in the media and in society as a whole. And so in a way I think Territories is very much a kind of holding a mirror, and it's also at the same time trying to play with the imagery, and also at the same time it's also these questions. One theme or one song in Territories is Joan Baez, and she says, "Against us is the power of the gold," and the idea of what gold signifies, and this question of power, and I think all of these different tensions, but also producing a certain creative interaction as well as there being a kind of friction.
Yeah.
So.
And I think that's why I wanted to start with the first work, the territories. It's you already told it. It's crossing borders. It's one of the aspects that's coming back every work that came after territories, I think. You were very open about your biography in the Riot book. You are telling or writing there that you were a punk, but that you loved soul music. And that's a kind of contradiction in itself, wasn't it?
Yeah, because I think in a way, I mean, I saw myself essentially as a black punk rocker, but I think in a way that wasn't completely normal for a younger black teenager. But I think in a way, what was really going on was the idea of being able to be more than one thing and not to also be the expected thing, is what I mean.
But it started very early with you, to get rid of those little rooms that they want to put you in.
Yes, I think so, because I think there's a way, if you're truly curious or inquisitive, in the way that I was, then I was really interested in going into the space you're not meant to enter into. So that's how I got to know people who were kind of part of the Beider Meinhof group. I mean, I didn't know that they were. I was very young.
Yeah, you were taught, you had an art education by one of the Beider Meinhof group.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, they showed...
I didn't know they were that creative.
Well, I mean, this person who I knew was going under a pseudonym, and, but she taught me the camera, how to take photographs, and also she belonged to a kind of news film collective, or a film collective, and...
But that was before you got to the art school?
Oh yes, that's long before I went to art school, yeah. And I was doing this when I was 15 and 16 and 17, so I had my own, you could say it's a bit like having your own private lessons,
was that,
really.
Was that why you started to make films instead of painting or sculpture in the art school, because of the education in the...
Well, I knew about filmmaking because, well, basically I talk about this in Riot book, but I was, a bored teenager, and so the people in my street who looked very interesting, who were these younger white people who dressed in a slightly hippie manner, they were the people who I befriended, and they were filmmakers, and so basically I understood how films were being made because I was kind of involved in one of their films, a film called True Romance, which was looking at questions around sexuality, and I was sort of a bit involved in that work. And so, yes, in a way, I was familiar with film, I was familiar with photography, and why people were making them, in a way making political works. But then I became very interested in art and in painting, and interestingly enough, some of the people who I befriended thought I was becoming too arty. They wanted, so my interests, were also apart from their interests, and so yes, and that was the beginning of my curiosity and going to art school. Yes.
The first work you are very proud of, I ask you that, is Looking for Langston, and it gave you also international recognition, I think. You won lots of prizes, I'm not going to mention them all. It's also about the position of black people, like territories, but in a totally different way. It's about a cultural icon. Can you, in a few words, explain who Langston Hughes was for the people who doesn't know? We should be ashamed.
No, but I didn't know who Langston Hughes was when I was at art school because, well, we were taught about black artists or black art history.
Mm-hmm.
But I was interested, of course. And Langston Hughes was a poet. He was a little bit like, I'd say, the Harry Belafonte of poetry at the time. You know, I'm popularizing him. But he was a very serious artist. He was someone who had travelled to Russia, and he was very well recognized, one of the most famous African-American poets, or Afro-American poets, as they would call themselves then. And he basically was part of this movement called Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was a black arts movement which was very involved in debates around modernism that coexisted around Harlem in New York. And they came about around the 20s and 30s. And I was just very interested in that period.
Why was that period so interesting for you?
Because in a way I was reading about modernism and in my sort of art history, but then in a way what was interesting for me was the way that these artists, who are black artists, were sort of interfacing with modernism or interfacing and making work during this period in the 20s. And also the relationship to jazz and all of these things which for me were fascinating. So I just became fascinated with that period. And I mean, later on, I mean, this film was made in 1989, and it was made while I was in this film collective, the Sankofa Film Video Collective. Yeah. And it was a sort of artistic movement. And the Harlem Renaissance had painters and writers and poets. And so it was just, and I think the other thing as well was that in London there was also this sort of artistic movement starting to grow as well. And so I think in a way I was trying to say in this work that these things happened in the early part of the 20th century, and in the latter part of the 20th century there's another sort of artistic movement that's taking place in London and in New York. And it's the kind of early days of, say, Steve McQueen, and it's the early days of Christopher Fillet, and there's a kind of thing that's happening in London, which is a sort of, that has a sort of black artistic aspect into it, which I thought has a kind of lineage or historical aspect to it. With the Harlem Renaissance, it's a kind of conversation. And I was very interested in America as well. I was very interested in black America.
Yeah, was it also the urge to rewrite history from the black perspective?
In a way, yes. But I think also it's also very important to make the connections between, say, different artistic periods or influences or contributions that perhaps black artists made, which are not quite recognised. And at the same time, to make a work which was very beautiful, and in a sense it was quite kind of homoerotic, but it was also very cineastic. It was about black and white cinema, silence, black and white photography. Yeah. It was really, it was bringing together all my interests in photography, because essentially Looking for Langston is about photography as well. It's not just about, the black themes, in a sense, you take them for granted, or the sort of gay themes, you take them for granted, but it's also about the use of black and white photography, and so it's bringing together a lot of my interests, aesthetic interests.
You were, for example, inspired by Roy de Caravaggio's Pictures of Harlem, Robert Mapplethorpe. You mentioned him, the studies, the homoerotic studies of George Platt-Lyons, but above all, James van der Zee. I didn't know that book, the Book of the Dead.
Yes, the Harlem Book of the Dead.
Yeah, yes. You can have a look at it.
Which is a fascinating book because Toni Morrison's beloved novel, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I mean, she was very influenced by this book. And it's a book which is cited quite a lot in African American cultures. And Van der Zee took these photographs of black corpses, funeral parlours, and they're very beautiful. And there was something about the way that they were made in a pictorial sense and the subject matter.
Yeah, there's some kind of Baroque excess.
Yes, there is, yeah.
With lots of flowers and furniture.
Yes, and they're really amazing photographs.
And you used that in your Langston movie, I think, when I just had this selection with lots of flowers too there, lots of floral.
Yeah, because I was very much,
Decoration.
it was a homage
Yeah.
to Van der Zee, and Van der Zee is the great black modernist, you know, photographer, American photographer. And yeah, so there was this idea of bringing together these worlds or these aesthetics and to bring those into another generation.
It's kind of typical for your work that you have many layers in it, because it's about these poets in America, it's about the Harlem Renaissance, it's about the gay scene, with the similarity with what's happening in London at the same time, and then all those photographers. I think you're doing that in the works later, that you are putting all those layers in it, and that you can't see in one time what your film is really about.
No, that's probably right. I mean, in a way, the multifaceted aspect of the works, because they're kind of multi-layered. I think it's more if you look at a work once and then you look at it twice, then those different layers can come out. Obviously, you have to have the time to do it.
Is that for you a kind of metaphor for how life is happening to us? It's also multi-layered, or is it nothing to do with that?
No, I think it absolutely is. I think there's a way in which the complexity of the world that we inhabit now is, I think the internet and the digital age made us aware of how complex everything is now. The way that we receive information, we get that so quickly. I think that's, you know, so you could say it's like an information overload.
Yeah.
But I think sort of like this kind of feeling about sort of information or knowledges and the experience is the multi-layered experience is something I guess I feel I've inhabited, you know, because I'm coming from, my parents are from the Caribbean, I grew up in England, you know, I'm black and gay, I'm an artist, I like punk rock, you know, there are all these different...
You love to dance.
Yes, I mean, there are all of these different things that I want to bring into the work, because I think in a way they're reflected, well, in my life experience. But then, of course, that's what you feel when you're young, to a certain extent.
You are working with lots of people, and this picture is really showing that you're always working with a big group of people, and you like to work together with other artists, with other disciplines, to make crossovers there too. Is that important to you to get inspired by other people? You often use poems, for example, as a starting point for your films.
Yes, I mean, I think there's a way in which I'm trying. I mean, the thing around film is that you have to master lots of different disciplines: sound, sculpture, music, montage, photography, lighting. So for me, that's very appealing, because I would be bored if I just had to master just one discipline.
Yeah, would you be bored?
Yes. So in a way, kind of being able to, all of those things, you have to master those in the film form, and they coalesce. But you can't really do that by yourself. So the disadvantage of making works in this sort of manner is that if you want to have the peacefulness of being in the studio by yourself, like a painter.
Yeah, then you should have been a painter.
Yes,
Yeah.
you know, but I have to admit that the thing about painting, or what I thought about painting earlier on, is that, you know, it's you and the canvas, and to a certain extent it's quite isolating. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to always be, because people now paint in lots of different ways. I mean, you know, kind of if you think about Koons, I mean, his paintings involve lots of different multi-layered approaches, and there's a big studio that he works with.
Yeah.
But I think the painting that I admire, you know, is not done in that way. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think I think maybe it's about the idea.
Socially a person.
Social, being in a club, bringing that club-like way of making art into the works that you'd make is a fun way of working.
And you're not only social, but your work is often, not often, always social engaged.
Yes, I hope so.
Is that because you were a real 80s boy?
No, I come from the 80s, and I think there's a way in which...
That was I remember the 80s as the time when we had demonstrations and that kind of things. We don't know that anymore.
I know. I never liked demonstrations very much, however. Because, I think, in a way, what came out of the 80s, you could say, is that you had one art form that became very dominant. But I think, for me, I was always interested also in art as a kind of fine art, or the kind of, well, I guess some people would say it's elitist, the kind of my interests. I'm sort of interested in elite art forms, but trying to democratize them, you could say. So you get accused of lots of different things if you're interested in those kinds of ideas. But in a way, I think, yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is that there were some things which were really important about the 80s, and there are things I didn't like about the 80s. So at the time when I made a work like Looking for Langston, it was very aesthetic work, and the kind of work which was more celebrated was more like agitprop work, or work that had the politics of it on its sleeve, and it didn't look very aesthetic. And so that's a whole debate, it's a whole way that people look at art even now. So I think, yes. Yeah,
but you make a wink in the movie too, because you used, for example, the Book of Harlem. It's really baroque, it's almost camp. Especially in the 80s it would have been camp. Is that a kind of trick you play to get closer to the people that are not really part of the art world? To the audience, I mean?
Well, I think, if you make work, you have to make work that you believe in. And I think if you're making work, you know that in the context of you're making work, there are styles, there are fashions, and there are ways of making work, which if you want to conform or tick all the right boxes, then you can make that work, and then everybody can go to sleep at night or be happier. But I'm not really that kind of artist. I'm the kind of artist that likes to make work.
You want us to stay up?
Well, not just ruffle a few feathers, but also to stay close to the things that you believe in, or to make work which has its own path. So that's the thing. There's a kind of orthodoxy in terms of what constitutes art in a particular vein, which I see myself as not wanting to adhere to. So.
But let's have a look at. I asked you what films did really inspire you, and you give me this badass cinema posters of the what's called blaxploitation. How do you pronounce it? Blaxploitation?
Blaxploitation
yes.
Films.
And you made a film about that too, badass. And that's also like, I see a similarity with the Harlem movie, that you make this wink to the baroque campy thing, and that you here make a wink to the B film, or not really a regular taste, the good taste movie.
No, you're right. It's a bit of a long story, but one of the things that happened in making the documentary Badass Cinema was that I was very interested. Well, some of the first films I went to see were in the cinema. I saw political films, which were kind of,
documentary or not?
Well, like Godard and things like that.
Yeah.
but the films that I went to see, the first films I went to see, were blaxploitation films and kung fu films.
And you couldn't tell that when you were in art school, or could you?
No, I mean you could do, but I mean they were frowned upon. And in a way you could say that in my works they were sort of antithetical to that kind of genre of making films. But when I was teaching, because I taught for a while in the States at Harvard University, I took a course which was in the art school, which is called Visual Environmental Studies, VES, but known to the students as Very Easy Studies. And one of the courses that I taught was it was a film course. One was a poetic documentary course. Another one was a video art history course, and there was another third strand which was called Black Cinema Genre. And I was showing people films, or experimental films, and I could see that a lot of students were falling asleep. And so I decided to take a cultural studies approach and to show films that they may be interested in. And I guess it came from Quentin Tarantino that I was very interested in some of the works that he was doing. He was a very controversial character. And so basically I introduced this course. It was called Blaxploitation Cinema to Quentin Tarantino. And I got over 600 students, so it was terrible because
they all liked the subject.
They liked the subject, yeah. But I was also overlaying a lot of cultural studies, psychoanalysis, semiotics. It was like a theoretical course, but looking at popular cultural films. And from teaching that course, then I did a lot of research, and then I decided, well, actually, the blaxploitation films are very interesting historically, and some friends of mine, Colin McCabe, who then was head of the British Film Institute, who later had his own production company, worked with the Independent Film Channel, and I was able to get funds to make this documentary, and from making that documentary, then I made Baltimore. So it's a quite convoluted way of how I got to make Baltimore, but I'm really glad that through teaching I was able to mix this sort of popular cultural taste with a video art. I mean, so in a way, once I made that documentary and did all the research, then making Baltimore, I was bringing all of these different genres together in the space of the gallery or the museum.
And you use Van Peebles also as an actor?
Yes, because Mo Van Peebles is the first person to make a film called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song in 1971. It was the highest ranking independent film, not just black film, but independent film at that time. But it's really a very strange film. But he's also very strange and interesting.
Why is he strange?
Because he's kind of like the godfather of black American independent film. But the films that he makes, they're very experimental. So, I mean, if he wasn't black, you know, his films would be shown in a sort of experimental program. Do you see what I mean? And so he's very interesting, but he's also, at the same time, a kind of entrepreneur. He wrote a book called Why Black People Should Invest in the Stock Exchange and things like that. So it's very interesting and very kind of eccentric.
But for this Baltimore, you also used a technique with colors and the way you just made it with the film material, that it's getting a kind of a sphere that you know from B movies. Why did you do that?
Because at the time, I think in 2003, there's a lot of interest in black science fiction, which was developing through different black in the American context. And basically I would say from 1994 to about 2002, I lived in America. I lived in New York. I write about this in Riot. And basically, it was through my experience of living in New York that I got to understand the art world in a different way, from the European way. But also, I think there's a way in which you could say that in a work like Baltimore, there's a way in which I'm trying to bring these questions into the space of art.
What is different in America and the art world?
Well,
Can you say that in 2 sentences?
Well, coming from my context, you know, the London art world is a very, is interested in art, but in a way from a kind of commercial perspective. You know, so you have the young British artists and the YBAs.
Yeah.
In America, it has a much sort of more mature relationship to art in the art world. I'm not talking about American culture.
Yeah.
So that's kind of quite nuanced. It's in New York, it's in Chelsea and Soho.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very unique and interesting, which is quite different from what I would call the continental European art world, or the art world situated in this area of Europe. You know, so they're all very different. I would just say that in at that time, the American art world was much more sophisticated than the London art world. Yeah. So.
And you made Baltimore. Was it in the how do you call an opdracht?
Commission.
Assignment.
Sci-fi.
No,
Assignment.
Was it an assignment for you?
Oh, an assignment. Yes.
Because you
Yes.
made the film or the installation in 3 musea in Baltimore.
Yes.
And it's not a coincidence that you went to Baltimore, or not?
Well, no, it is. I mean, one of the things that developed with Baltimore was that I was approached by a curator who was interested in the museum without walls concept. And so you had the contemporary museum in Baltimore that didn't have a building. And the idea was that the artists would come to Baltimore and make a work that would be that would bring different institutions together. So over the period of a year, I basically got friendly with the Waters Art Gallery, which has a kind of fantastic Renaissance collection, and then basically went to the Great Blacks in Wax Museum, which is a real museum that does exist, which was a bit like a Thomas Hirschhorn installation gone wrong, with lots of black wax figures. And what I thought was really interesting about it was the question of memorialization, that one museum is trying to remember its history and its past, and then there's another museum which is also trying to do that, but it doesn't have the resources. But nonetheless,
and they are really separate.
They were quite
because
separate.
You have the White Art History Museum,
yes,
and the Great Black Wax.
Yes, and so
and
what? No,
there's no relation between them.
And I was trying to bring these two histories together within the my Baltimore project.
Yeah.
So I got the black wax works, and I put them into the museum in Waters Art Gallery. I mean, it's all very complicated, and it was quite difficult to do it. But
what made it difficult?
But because those two institutions don't really talk to one another, basically, yeah. So they needed the artists to bring together the conversation. Once it happened, though, people got terribly excited, and everybody started taking photographs. And I said, "You can't do that. It's my work." But it was interesting. And I made the wax model of Melvin Van Peebles, so that model didn't exist.
Why did you have the urge to make a wax model of him and give him a place in the wax museum?
Well, I think it was really the idea of the role of the artists, because you had the black political leaders.
In the great history, there weren't artists?
There was a few artists. There were quite a few artists, but Melvin Van Peebles wasn't in it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I made the waxwork. My intention was for the waxwork to be part of the collection, but the Melvin Van Peebles said no way.
Yeah.
Like my model is not going into that museum, you know.
Why not?
Because he didn't like it. He thought it was a bad museum. But
Van Peebles didn't want to get into the museum.
Yeah, he thought it was a terrible museum.
I understood that the museum didn't like his wax.
They wanted the waxwork very much. It ended up going to the Studio Museum in Harlem, so it is in a collection. And
in another museum.
In another museum, yeah.
Where you felt more comfortable. You're working, I think it's the first time in Baltimore with the multiple screen.
Yes, I mean, in a way...
This is the show in Berlin, the Berlin Biennale.
Yes, it's the first time that the multiple screen works start to have a certain scale, and...
Before that it was just a television format, or what?
Well, the first multiple screen works I made was actually during my Turner Prize nomination, but the multiple screen works began to become, I guess, more sophisticated when I did Baltimore, because its use of sort of surround sound, and of course for the Berlin Biennale in 2004 when we showed Baltimore, it was quite an event because of, in a way, I was interested in the idea of, I guess, because history painting. I was trying to do history painting through video art.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the...
And that's why you had to get the large scale and the multiple screens, because you wanted to make some historical piece of it?
Well, I think it was more to do with like thinking about what is the nature of, what would history painting be like if it's made through a video artist or film? What would, you know, with videos you can work with scale, but also with the multiple screen works, I guess the other question I was trying to pose for myself was what's the difference between making a sort of film work in a gallery setting versus a sort of more classical setting or film, like if you go to see films in the cinema.
Yeah.
And so I needed to have an excuse really for making works on alibi, for making works in an art context. And the thing about making works in art context versus making them in a more traditional classical context is really around experimentation, around the image, and the multiple screen, if you like, language was a language which was developing through artists like Bill Viola and Doug Aiken, and also you know, many video artists who are working also in Marijke, precisely. Yeah, you know, I mean, she was very, very prominent at a particular time. I mean, she still is, but I mean, she was very involved in that language. And you had a whole group of people who were working and trying to build this sort of language for making moving image works in the art context. And, you know, artists like Marijke, I would say myself, Doug Aiken, Stan Douglas, there's lots
and
of us.
You mentioned Steve McQueen, but Steve McQueen once chose to get out of the art world and into... Was it an option for you? Did you think about that?
No, I mean, I had made films before, because I'd made films that had gone to the Cannes Film Festival and been showing lots of different film contexts. And someone like Steve, who I used to tutor when he was at Goldsmiths, was someone who always wanted to make films in a kind of film context, in a kind of mainstream context. But I mean, I saw Steve the other day, and actually, I mean, he's making a piece for Venice. I think he's just doing both things. He's just having fun. He's, you know, he can make a movie in a kind of mainstream space, but he'll always, I think, continue to make works in an art context as well. So I think, I don't know if you have to really choose. It's just that you make different works and different things you can do in the different spaces. So I think perhaps we have a more pluralistic approach to how you can make works, but maybe audiences tend to want to slot you into like a box. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
But I mean, the thing is that, you know, very few people have had that sort of critical success and attention, you know, that Steve has had. You know, there's not many directors in England that have won Oscars for their works. You know, so I think, you know, that is quite different. But I think, in a way, the energy, at least, for making the moving image works and making art in that context, they develop, you know, in the art context rather than in the kind of film context, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So
you feel more free in the art context.
Precisely,
to
yes.
just experiment and getting other formats to your...
Yeah, and to be involved in different languages and different art forms, and not just film. It could be photography, it could be sculpture, etc. Yeah.
You're really what you call yourself, or like to call, visual poetics. In all of your films, are those moments where the images are getting really abstract, and just help yourself. Should I give you some wine? We can open the bottle, huh?
Yeah, why don't we do that?
Yeah. Come, I give you one. Sorry. And you want it in the water or next to the water? Next. Next, okay.
Thank you.
Almost should ask somebody else, but... this is still from Vagabondia, where you use the split screen, a lot of mirrors, and there's becoming those kind of moments when you're really getting into a kind of abstraction, in a kind of mood. The mood is more important than the image. Why do you need that? Because that's what you, I think, not really can do in the Hollywood production.
You're right, and I agree with that. But I think that in that work in Vagabondia, it's a project which developed from...
it's also shot in a museum.
It is, in the Sir John Soane Museum. It was a project that Hans Orbris, who is a curator who likes to work in situ with house museums. And I had wanted to make a work in Sir John Soane Museum for quite a long time, but it was quite difficult to get access to it. And his project was about putting contemporary art next to art from the Grand Tour.
Yeah.
And this museum is a wonderful museum. It's a house museum.
It's full of colonialistic collection, I think.
Yeah, I mean it's assembled from the Grand Tour.
Yeah.
Sir John Soane designed the Bank of England, and you know he came from working class origins and became a very important architect, and was able to get a decree from the government at that time, from Parliament, to make his house become a museum. His collection is a house museum.
Yeah.
And so it's in the middle of Bloomsbury, which is where I live, and so it's very interesting collection. And so in a way this work is very much trying to mimic visually the architectural motifs in that space. And the kaleidoscopic kind of aspect of that work is very much looking at the space and mirroring that in terms of how you film the movement and all those kinds of things. But you're absolutely right, this is precisely the kind of work that you couldn't make at all in the kind of more traditional context, but it was very exciting work to make, and
it's a kind of disturbing too, because it seems like you are looking at the same picture that is mirrored in the middle, but it's also having some kind of schizophrenic atmosphere, as if you're looking at two realities in the same time.
Yeah, because in a way, in that film, I'm very interested in the kind of, you could call it the psychic relationship, or the sort of phantasmatic, the fantasies which develop within the space of, you could say, the kind of mood that the house gives. and to bring things back to life and the different echoes, historical echoes.
It's a kind of Alice in Wonderland, you walk through the museum.
Yes, it is. And I mean, how it's designed is a kind of cabinet of curiosities. As one sort of space opens into another space, and sometimes the space collapses onto itself. It is a very interesting architectural space, and the way that the collection has been also is very centric. How
and in this film you have your mother talking Creole.
Yes, and my mother speaks Creole in the work, and it's purposely untranslated because I was very interested, if you like, looking at the Creole language as being this the other side of the Sir John Soane modernity.
Yeah.
Yes, and having this voice from the colonies or from slavery, you could say, this Creole language which was developed out of this encounter. It's like a broken French, African languages, British English. It was a language that it was developed so the master wouldn't be able to understand what was being said.
Yeah.
And so it was a kind of strategy in the language, a secret language. And in a way it was like the mirror, it was like acoustically mirroring the other space of modernity or the other side of the history of the Sir John Soane architectural space.
There's also that splitting. It's not only splitting in the images,
Yes.
also in the sound and the
Yes.
languages.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a curious work. I mean, it's one of the first works of mine which was collected in many museum collections, including the Tate.
And you were inspired by Le Maître Fou. I saw it this week. It's really crazy. Film from Jean Koch.
Yeah, Jean Rouch is someone who, you know, made this amazing film called La Maître Fou.
It's totally different from your work.
It's totally
a documentary,
different.
but it's a really strange film about local people in Ghana who are under kind of
Voodoo spell.
Are getting possessed by the colonials.
Yes.
And they are imitating the colonials in the way they look at us. I can say us.
Yes.
But you get a real different view of of white people when you see that movie.
Yeah, I mean, it was banned, in fact. You know, it was banned in France when Jean Rouch made that film. And I guess you could say, I mean, La Maître Fou, the Mad Masters, is, in a way, sort of the inspiration for making the work. And the figure who is a trickster figure that appears in the work is modelled on these people that, you know, get possessed. So he's like a possessed spirit within the work. But, you know, these are all my ideas. I mean, somebody else that's looking at the work, they can have their own ideas about the work. So, but the intentions behind the creation of it is, you know, just one reading of the work.
It's a kind of the other way around. The colonials who look, the locals who look to the colonials, and now you walking through the museum of a colonial, looking back.
Yes.
The Creole. Yeah.
Precisely.
The split image is also a piece of your playtime film, and in this split image, the auctioneer is almost a schizophrenic, satanic person. Was it meant?
Yeah. Well, I think
not coincidental that he has a red background.
Yeah, I mean, I like red. You know, I mean, I think at the time when I liked the use of red as a kind of image, but I mean, I don't really see him as being satanic.
But why did you split him in this film?
I think in a way, there's the idea of, well, you could call it image manipulation or experimentation But the thing about someone like Simone Puri, what I think makes him a very interesting character, is on the one hand, he is someone who is very important in the world of finance and art, and he has a deep knowledge of art. And at the same time, he's someone who is literally making sort of capital through literally enunciating, through speaking.
Yeah.
And the auction house.
Driving up the prices.
Yeah, the auction house is really, you know, one of the kind of centres of the London art world. You know, and there's records which are being broken all the time. And so, in a way, you could say that, you know, in terms of this kind of doubling of, because I'm interested in doubling, and in a sense, in these sections, he's really merely, in a way, performing himself, but there's a kind of doubling in the way that he both presents himself and what he does, because behind him is an immense army of people working, you know, literally, who are constructing and sort of doing a hardcore research behind this performance. You know, so there's a kind of double aspect, you know, because there's the kind of double theatrical aspect of what he does, which is an important element in the art context, or in the art context. But then there's this other aspect that's behind, which is deeply researched. So I think, yeah, so I was interested in this kind of double aspect that I think that someone like Simone's character presents, because he's, in a way, one of the only non-actors in the piece as well.
Yeah.
So,
there's also a layer in
yeah.
it. We will have a look at Plato later, but first want to finish with this still from 10,000 Waves, where you have also this visual poetry. It reminds me of painting, and I asked you if painting is anyway an inspiration for you, and you came with lots of photographs and pictures from especially Peter Dork and Gerhard Richter. And Gerhard Richter is, let's just have a quick look at it. How is he inspiring you? He's also one of the most famous painters of the 20th century, I think.
Yes, but I think he is. I think, you know, with Richter, I think for me, in this later work, I'm very interested in the way in which there's a use of colour. In the case of this work, which is actually a photographic work, there's a way in which painting and photography come together in this work behind us. But then I think it's really about the use of colour and the idea of collision and the kind of mistake, improvisation, and the way that sort of colours being utilised, you know, which produces a certain sort of both tension, but also something which is very sort of unique, you know, so in terms of the use of colour in the work. You know, so in Richter you feel there's a conceptual approach to his painting. It's not just to do with improvisation.
Is he inspiring you in, for example, a work like 10,000 Waves, when you put those coloured screens in the scene and playing with that filmish?
Well, I think there are different homages, you know, there's Richter homages, there's Jacques Tati homage, and there are all these different homages which I feel that I'm trying to make in my relationship to sort of someone like Peter Doig, is really to do with the idea of at the particular moment when we were at art school.
He was a student in the same time as you were.
Yeah, he was a few years older than I am, but we went to St Martin's more or less at the same time, He graduated before I did, but I mean, the thing about that work was the idea of aesthetics and the idea of beauty and that relationship, which is quite an antagonistic relationship. I believe there was a few reviews about this exhibition that theme came out as antagonistic to the work. And I think there were very early conversations that we used to have around pictorialism and the use of colour, these kinds of things. And I know there's a kind of transgression in my field around the use of those aspects. But you know, it's quite a deliberate intervention or use that I'm involved in. So, and someone like Peter is also very interested in film.
Yes, because he has a film. You know, he shows films at his home in Trinidad.
Yes, and I was invited.
He invites the local people to come and see films he really likes.
That's right.
And one of it was your Badass Cinema.
Badass Cinema, yes. Yeah. He invited me to the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, and the screenings that he had took place in the Studio Film Club that he was doing, and he would make these posters for
he's hanging them up in the city and just invites people at his home.
Yeah, but Peter Doyle is a very cineastic person. He's very interested in cinema, and there are lots of conversations that we have about cinema quite often. And I mean, historically, but I think there's a relationship to these themes in art and how they derive or come about in painting, and then how they come out of painting and go into film. Yeah, so I think there's that kind of conversation.
And he's a painter organising movie nights, but you are a video artist organising exhibitions. You are a curator also. That's not a part of you that everybody knows, I think. We have a few examples. One show you made for Serpentine Gallery about Derek Jarman.
Yes, I created an exhibition on Derek Jarman film called Brutal Beauty, and it was an archival exhibition. Basically, I had teamed up with Tilda Swinton and Colin McCabe to make a documentary about Derek Jarman, but it was also part of a curatorial project which I was developing, where I wanted to also foreground some of his paintings and to make an exhibition that would have
the whole people, the whole man, and not only the filmmaker.
Precisely, yeah. And yes, it was quite an interesting experience making that work, because I was working with James Mackay, the producer of Derek Jarman's films, and at the time he was very interested in trying to get Tate Modern to acquire 70 of Derek Jarman's Super 8 films. And one of the things that I was involved in was trying to foreground these Super 8 films, which in a sense were like paintings. And one of the exciting things that developed from making that exhibition was the fact that the Luma Foundation, which is run ostensibly by Maya Hoffman, stepped in and did this huge conservation work and bought the 70 Super 8 films for about 1.4 million, and then spent sort of quite a lot of money on doing the conservation work on Derek Jarman's early Super 8 films. So there were a number of ambitions in terms of making that exhibition. There was the foreground of Super 8 films, re-articulating Derek Jarman for a new audience, and I think we succeeded in doing that.
And how is curating related to your own art making? It's totally different to make an exhibition about somebody else's work. How is that related to you making your own work in your own studio?
Well,
because a lot of your work is going about exhibitions too. The Baltimore is about how the musea, different musea are handling their collection.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very interested in curating. I think in a way you could say there's one form of curating, but I think there are many forms of curating. And of course, creating is not just about creating in a museum context, it's also about other forms, which are not necessarily in the space of the gallery necessarily. But I think in relationship with the Brutal Beauty exhibition, one of the things that I learned in making that exhibition was the salon hang of the Derek Jarman works. And then I was very interested in replicating the salon hang when I tried to put together several of these Super 8 films and to show them in this kind of motif. And doing that enabled me to then develop the way that I wanted to show 10,000 Waves in an exhibition context. So I think you're always, in a way, one's always thinking about exhibition context. And even for playtime,
you made another show together with James Franco and Glenn Scott, right? In your own gallery.
Yeah.
And it's cinematic visions painting at the edge of reality. It was called, but it's also one set of your playtime installation, or isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, because basically I created a show for Victoria Miro Gallery. It's called Cinematic Visions Paintings on the Edge of Reality. And the idea was to assemble a lot of the paintings which we assembled were paintings which artists who are painters thought about the cinematic in the works. They had several references, either visually or in language, etc., etc.
Yeah,
and
Peter Burke was also on the show.
Yes, and the idea was really to create a space where then James would do this tour of the exhibition.
But did you make the exhibition because you wanted to film it?
Yes.
Really? You made a whole exhibition just to make...
Yes, because it was very important that you had real Peter Doigs and that you had real Glenn Ligans, and all those works were real paintings, not imitation paintings.
But it was also open for the public, huh?
It was open for the public, yes, and the exhibition was made as a kind of fundraiser for an organisation called Bottle Top, who basically tried to raise funds for different youth groups in different parts of the world, disadvantaged parts of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, and also in England. And so it was a kind of fundraiser. But I had been in a long conversation with James Franco and with my gallery about making the exhibition, and then this exhibition would be part of the work. So it's not that he's walking into a space that happens to be a show that Victoria Miro is showing.
You made the show
yeah,
for him to walk in.
I did, yes.
Yeah. How long did you work on playtime?
For a couple of years.
Yeah, it must be, when you make a whole exhibition for one part of the film. The inspiration also came from a movie of the famous director Jacques Tati. Playtime, the same title, and I think the same ruffle, the same jazzy sound in the beginning.
Yes, because Playtime, I think Jacques Tati's Playtime is such a wonderful film, and
it's about getting lost in a new and modern city, I think.
It is, it's a science fiction film. I mean, of course, Jacques Tati is a master director, but I'm just merely quoting a few bits from him. So, but it was a fun idea to think about Capital being a kind of playtime activity in terms of how hedge fund managers work with capital, but then also how the art world in some ways works with art and capital, and how artists work with art and capital. And so, yeah, so that was the Playtime title.
So you had the Tati, you had the capital, you have a lot of influences, and then how do you start with such an idea? Where did it start with? With the capital or with the tattoo?
Well, with both, in a way, yeah.
Together?
Yeah, well, it started with actually the crash that happened in Iceland in 2008. I had a friend who built this modernist house, and basically
Here, the photographer.
Yes, the photographer, and he was really affected by the crash.
Yeah,
and
he was building his dream house.
Yeah, and what happens...
And his dream just blew.
Yeah, but it's interesting what happens when capital stops flowing.
Yeah.
And we're going to find out about that in Greece, I guess. But what happens to society, to culture, to people when capital is stopped in its tracks? What are its effects? And so this friend of mine, his name is called Thorsten Hahn, he's a photographer, he's German, and he's worked with me on all my photographic works. He was really affected by the crash.
Yeah.
And so in a way, it's his story, and in a way it's interesting now because of course what happened recently in Iceland.
You had it on your Facebook page.
Yeah.
Iceland began to jail bankers.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. What if we all the countries should follow that example?
Well, I think there's a very extreme example of what happened in Iceland. So I don't know if all the countries would follow that, but I think that what happened there was not good. And so I'm not surprised that that's happened. That's just the beginning, really. But there was something that happened in Iceland which I think, they were probably just at the tip of the iceberg of.
Why did you felt the urge to say something about capital?
Well, I think...
because that's playtime is about a lot of things. It's about money, how it makes the world go round, like the song. It's about architecture, it's about the art world, how the art world is infected with capitalism, I think. It's about a lot of personal stories, and all the personal stories are stories that are very close to yourself. It's your own housekeeper, it's your friend, the photographer, it's your auctioneer, it's a friend, an actor who is also a painter. So in a gallery that's yours. There's a lot. Why did you wanted to say something about capitalism in this way?
Well, I think first and foremost that I think capital is an enigma, because we can't live without it. And there are many amazing things that you can do with capital, and I think that in my own practice or in my own work, that I do need sometimes quite a bit of capital to be able to make my artistic statement. So I think, so I think there are all of those things that you are very sensitized to or aware of. But I think as well, there's the other aspects which, I think that it's. I think one thing that happened when I made 10,000 Waves was that it took me quite a long time to raise the funds for making that work because of the 2008 crash. And I remember walking in the Frieze Art Fair and many galleries saying, we're never ever going to come to this place again because, and it was very severe, but nothing compared to what happened in Iceland, of course. So, in a way, one of the things that developed out of playtime was to make a work that would look at some of these questions. And it's not just me, because there's many artists and curators who are interested in this theme, and in fact, but what's quite interesting is that some curators, when they've seen the work, have said, how on earth could you have somebody as horrible as Timothy Puri in your work, or have somebody like James Franco in your work, because it's dreadful, So there's been this antithetical response as well, where people kind of, are really don't, you know, and I think...
How do you feel about that?
Well, no, I just think it's very interesting, because I think, you know...
I think it's interesting for you, like when you use the B-movie kind of thing, that you're just playing around with that kind of crossovers too.
Yes, but I think that I think people like the idea of being either or, being against something or for something.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the role of the artist is to question, is to kind of push boundaries and push questions. But I think, in a way, we can't, to some extent, I guess what I'm saying, is that we can't live without bankers.
Yeah. Is that why you use
and you know, so it's kind of what's the alternative, you know? So the thing is, it's kind of there's always the critique, but we can't live really without some of these professions. So in playtime, it's an either or, you know. It's kind of I'm just in a way trying to display that and to reflect on what I think societies are going through to a certain extent, and I think that the role of the artist is to do that. So I think that's part of our role, and it will be a theme that will be looked at quite extensively in Venice, because I'm involved in quite a big project in Venice, which I can't really talk that much about now.
You started.
Yeah. I
don't think
I started it. I think there's a lot of people that are interested in it as a question.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So, yeah. But I think it's, because it involves lots of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But okay, you're not going to tell us anything about it, the Venice piece, but the playtime what you were talking about, that we can't live without the capital, and we can't we need those kind of systems. Is that why you choose to use those stories so close to yourself and use yourself also? It's like Hitchcock, who's always entering his own films. You are 2 times, I think, really short time you are in the installation.
It's rather unfortunate, because I hate seeing my own image, but yes.
But what's unfortunate?
Because I like to picture people, not picture my...
Yeah, but you choose to have yourself into it.
I didn't really, actually.
But you are the artist. You make the choices, don't you?
You do, but I think sometimes you're also making choices for other reasons. You know,
yeah, isn't it that you want us to see that you are also part of that game?
Yes, yes.
That's
absolutely.
why you're in it?
But it's not the only reason.
What's the other?
There are other reasons to do with showing the means of production, deconstruction, all the kind of 80s ideas of trying to foreground the way that things are being made, and that is part of the artwork. Yeah.
Do you have a solution for those capitalism
Pardon?
problems? Do you have a solution, an idea of a solution for the capital system and where it's... Or are you just showing us how it's working?
No, I mean, I think there are lots of ideas in playtime that I'm very interested in, and in some ways I'm trying to share some of those ideas. So I'm very interested, for example, in the idea of dark pools and what high frequency trading is, and how capital and, you know, millions are made in milliseconds, and there's a whole part of capital which is working at a particular level, which is controlling a lot of our lives, but we're not aware of how those things are working.
And we don't understand it.
And people don't understand it. So people don't understand what hedge funds are necessarily, you know. So, I mean, they're just these sorts of aspects of, there are these kind of references. We know that hedge funds are closely linked to art world, because without hedge funds, perhaps not many of my works would be bought at. You know, so I would say that, you know, that one's implicated. But I think it's just also to do with a mirror, you know, there's a kind of mirror aspect in the playtime work.
This is how it works.
Yeah, it could be just a portrait of the artist, in fact. Playtime could just be a self-portrait.
But also a portrait of the spectators, because we can't see your work without the money that's making it.
That's absolutely true, yeah.
So we're all part of it.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's quite complex, I think, but I think, you know, one of the things around art is really trying to create a meaning that moves the spectator in another way, you know, that you can have identifications with things because they move you in a particular manner, or, you know, through their beauty or the concepts or whatever it is, you know. So I think there are always those other aspects which also I'm interested in,
Yeah.
and I think that's my true relationship with the audience.
Yeah. To seduce us with your beauty, with the